Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, as well as pharmacovigilance. We offer three different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employee recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I am speaking with Marwan Fathallah. How are you, Marwan?
Doing good. How are you, Nick?
I'm doing excellent. Thanks for joining.
Sounds good.
Okay, so before we jump in for the topic for today, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Be happy to. Well, first of all, Nick, thanks for having me. And for the audience, just really a pleasure to connect with you. A little bit of my background. So I've been in the industry for close to 30 years. I've been very fortunate to have run a number of functions and broader responsibilities and then executive responsibilities in the life science sector. So all the way from drug development to medical devices to diagnostics, from running research and development to operation to regulatory, clinical, scientific affairs, and then most recently the chief operating officer in a very large diagnostics company, and then obviously here at DIA Global as the CEO.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. So what are we talking about today?
Well, I'd love to share with you a really important topic that I have learned to appreciate over many, many years that will drive a successful outcome in the product development cycle. And that's really about leadership skills. The leadership skills that are the most critical in each stage of the drug and the development, drug and device life cycle, all the way from innovation to patient delivery, and how, as an executive, you can ensure the alignment between these critical stakeholders to deliver a quality product to the customers and, frankly, to the patients, which is what we all serve. So I'm really looking forward to discussing that and touching on the R&D, regulatory, commercial intersect, so that way we can make sure the patient priorities are well served.
Yeah, excellent. Well, as we were talking about before we hit record, there's a lot to cover there. So we'll see how deep into this we can get.
Sounds good.
Um, Probably starting at the highest of levels. The word culture is a constant theme throughout leadership and management, and something that I think our industry as well as other industries have been covering in detail over the past several decades. So why don't we start with what is this type of culture where you're trying to ensure that there's innovation, scientific rigor, and all of that as we're moving through drug and device development.
Be happy to. You know, it's an interesting, I always say life is a balance, right? You got to balance and juggle all these demands. And when you step back and you think about it, over my career, having had all these functions reporting into me, I've learned, I always use this word, what makes each function tick. Everybody is
Mm,
striving to get a product to the patient to change an outcome. But here's sort of the tension and the struggle a little bit. And then culturally becomes critical that we pay attention to that. So the leaders in the drug and the device development space, they face a pretty unique challenge. Okay. It's balancing innovation, which by definition means it's thriving for the flexibility and then also to be able to experiment and then to risk take. Okay. And then on the scientific and regulatory side, it's the rigor.
mm,
You absolutely want to make sure it works and it works the first time, it's safe and it's effective.
mm,
And you always consider things like precision, validation, adherence to
mm.
protocols, Whereas flexibility, you want to be creative and innovate. So then the culture you want to foster to maintain this balance between them becomes critical.
Mm-hmm.
So here's sort of what I always say to leaders to be able to foster this culture of innovation while balancing that scientific rigor. You got to first create a safe environment. So, and that's a safe environment to encourage the teams to share these unconventional ideas. Okay, that gives you that creativity. And then also set up this mindset of, it's safe to fail. It's okay. And then yet you want to also say it's important that you fail quickly so that way you can adjust. But you also want to embed the compliance feeling. So instead of looking at regulatory as a compliance function, you want to drive it, you want to embed it into the innovation, as opposed to, well, it's the end result, and then the compliance team will tell you if it's a go or no go. So aligning those expertise and that talent of regulatory early in the innovation process goes a long way. Both parties benefit from that. They rub off of each other, if you will, and it drives the process in a more balanced way. So to me, that's critical. That cross-functional team that engages the innovation from the scientist to the engineer to the regulatory professional to the marketing early on becomes critical to drive this interdisciplinary collaboration. That drives innovation. That drives a balanced view of risk and execution.
Love it. And that was very well said in terms of balancing the innovation with the scientific end and being rigorous in terms of that. I can see where you're going with partnering these groups early on. A couple questions I have is, well, what are the different participants that should be involved in such a movement and I want to say it's more than a meeting, it's the whole process. And there's also this concept of trying to ensure that people don't participate in meetings where, because we've all been there, where you go into a meeting, you don't know why you were invited, and then you leave because you never said anything. So how do we A, ensure that doesn't happen, or B, at least ensure that those members that maybe aren't participating are aware of why they're being there?
Yeah, good question. I always see that as that's the leadership quality that's critical. So that way you could be efficient and then you could build that trust across. So I am very much a trained Lean Six Sigma type of a person. So efficiency is critical for delivery, okay, whether it's speed to market or even the quality of what you're going to deliver. So I always start off with, do we have the stakeholders that are required in the process? Yes, it takes a village, but what you don't want is to have spectators. You want folks that would be engaged in the process, which means understanding who the stakeholders are is critical. And then bringing those stakeholders earlier in the process with a defined outcome. So you probably have heard the term Kaizens. So with Kaizens, you set the problem that you want to solve. You define it. So everybody's clear about what we're trying to define. You also want to set expectations of what you want to achieve. The how to achieve it and the process to achieve it has to be very well laid out so the participants have a role in it defined. So for me, whenever you have an idea of bringing a product to the market, it starts with what problem are we trying to solve? Where's the unmet needs? Um, who are the stakeholders that will deliver it? Whether it's R&D to develop the product, marketing to figure out how to market it when it's available. The project manager has to put together the integrated plan. The regulatory team that has to figure out how to interact with the regulators to understand, what is it going to take to do the clinical trials and also, the regulatory submission. All these folks have to be well spelled out.
Mm-hmm.
So bringing the team in, letting them know what we're aiming to achieve based on the problem that we're trying to solve becomes critical in defining it. Over the years, what I've learned is if you bring people in to that stage and you make them aware that they each here has a role to play with a skeleton of what problem are we trying to solve, what the approach we think it is, and then get them to then build that structure. Then everybody knows what their contribution is, by when, and what the deliverable is, and how we're going to be successful.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So we'll call this group of people the Product Development Committee for the purposes of this podcast.
Sure.
Cadence is very important,
Yes.
as well as time.
Yeah.
So for somebody that's listening to this podcast and they're saying, I understand the balance Marwan's talking about. I understand how, using Kaizen, I can identify what what we're trying to accomplish, who are the stakeholders, and where do they contribute. What would a committee such as this look like over the process of time in terms of how often would you be expecting this committee to come together and how much time in each individual meeting would they be spending together?
Very good. So again, I'll just lean on my Lean Six Sigma kind of principles, okay? So over the years, for projects, I would create a project room. Project room is where everybody sits. So I bring the regulatory team, I bring the R&D team, the marketing team, the clinical team. They all coexist in the project room. Okay. Yes, of course, there's R&D being done in the labs. Yes, there is, work being done, in other functions. But the representatives and the folks who are the stakeholders and the leaders of their function, they're there because you want them to coexist and then align with each other all the time. So the cadence would be that once a week, the project manager would have the timeline on the wall. And then for each function that is a stakeholder in the process, would be able to what we call daily management. They would go up and say, as an example, this is where we are on the regulatory deliverables. We were to reach out to FDA, engage them earlier in the process so we can understand what is the submission going to look like and what are the requirements. And then feed that information back to the team so that way we can go ahead and figure out the work that it needs to be done on the clinical side, on the development side, and et cetera, et cetera. So that cadence happens in this room. It happens at what we call stand up. You go up to the wall, you talk to your piece. It's short and sweet, so that way straight to the point. And then anything that needs to be followed up is followed up in that room. It's sort of the symphony with the maestro being the project manager that's working through that. I found that to be extremely effective. It improves communication. It keeps everybody clear on the overall progress and who's dependent on who. And then at the same time, it holds everybody to the deliverables that they have.
Okay. And that is a daily stand-up meeting, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Now, so I'm gonna throw some things at you. We've all been in, or many of us have been in meetings similar to that. And some of the things that a particular function might be involved in, you're not going to get daily things accomplished, right? There it takes time.
Yep.
And so we know when we call on that person, they say no update, right? Generally, you probably have different ways of saying it, but no update. It's only been 24 hours.
Sure.
How do you balance having a function saying in a reasonable manner, I have no update, versus at what point should I hold that person accountable and say, why isn't there an update by now?
Very good. So the standing meetings, there's also KPIs, right? So are
Hmm.
you on track? Are you off track?
Right.
Right.
Hmm.
If you're on track, great. You should be able to move on. If you're off track, what's the gap that you're off track with, and what are we doing to solve it? Right. So
Hmm.
you
Yep.
should be able to speak to that. Okay? The project manager tees that up, and you're able to communicate it. For the folks who are tracking to progress, that they give you always, no update. Um, for a week that would go by, and then they're just not able to give an update, the project manager forces an update. Okay, because what happens is at the end of the week, usually there's the head of R&D, there's the head of the business, the general manager, etc. They want an update for the project, the overall. So what ends up happening is the project manager tees up the story at the end of the week. So that way the other bigger stakeholder know, because they have to make adjustments in their plan. These guys are always going to get to the promised land that we need. So that way, whatever financial commitments we gave the company is still on track. In there, you get the bigger update, I call it the story. But if somebody a week later still not giving you an update, and you want to, you trust, but you want to verify, you tee that up with that individual to put them on the spot and say, we're going to be ready to have that discussion, the storytelling at the end of the week. We really need to make sure, where are you with the update, because this is likely to come up, and we need to make sure we're all holding hands. I find that sort of like a transparent, honest discussion with those who may not want to give an update because they think everything is fine becomes critical when they know the team is accountable and the story has to be shared.
The person that you said that is going to push back on this, did you say they were the project manager? Was that what you said, or
The manager is the maestro, right?
the
Is the
maestro? Okay.
has to kind of work through this.
And typically for the person that's the project manager for this product development committee, who owns that? Is that the CEO? Is that the head of marketing, the head of R? Who sits in that seat typically?
So obviously, each company has their own structure. I'll answer your question in generalities. I'm happy to go some specifics. So normally, what ends up happening is the project management function tends to be an independent function because they're the coordinator, the maestro that everybody trusts, right?
Yep.
Otherwise, somebody will say, "Well, you're in the marketing function. You're trying to really make sure that the marketing people are getting the pass, and the R&D people are getting hammered." So the most successful that I have seen is, and I have experienced that I've had, is keep that project management, we call it program management function, independent.
Okay.
That reports into, if it's a business unit head that has the functions reporting to them, keep them separate, right? Um, and it's the role of the program management function to work with the other stakeholders to tell the story and work with the inefficiencies or the subtleties that you were highlighting that may be not going well.
Mm.
And if it doesn't move the needle, then they work with the respective heads of the leaders This is why I believe the best leaders are the leaders who have actually experienced the overall program from concept to post market because they appreciate what happens and they're
Mm,
the least defensive.
love it. The other thing I wanted to touch on was the KPIs, on track, off track.
Yeah,
Two things are true. One is KPIs that are set to start and end within 24 hours is too short. Another KPI that, for purposes of a product development committee, are going to be too long is a year.
yeah.
Right, so when is an appropriate amount of time to set up a KPI where you say, all right, we're starting on point X, and by point Y, we expect that activity, that responsibility has been completed.
Yeah, so I have a personal philosophy on KPIs. You can create KPIs that's window dressing, where it's a feel good KPI. You know,
Mm,
okay, we've achieved it. The problem with that is it's too late if it doesn't hit its mark. So I'm really big on leading indicators, right? So the KPI has to be structured in a way that give you insight and drive a result, right? So, for example, a good way to look at things is, well, you could put a KPI for a product development in R&D that says complete the verification and validation of, let's just call it a device. That's it. That's all the KPI that the project manager has. Here's the issue with that. Like you said, it's too long. It could be a year before we get there. So you have to have KPI milestones that lead you there. For example, some KPIs would be feasibility test results. You should be tracking that because if those are trending in a negative way, well, likely that KPI for getting a verified and validated product so you can sell it is going to get impacted. Another one could be a clinical study. You want that KPI for that clinical study there. We call it a dry run clinical study and a full fledged clinical study. So these critical milestones that give you insight into the long-term KPI have to be mapped out. Because if not, you're not managing risk, and then you're going to get surprised.
yeah, great. So I love what you have to say. I have a lot of the same philosophies. I use some different language, which is influenced by EOS. So there's just to kind of complement what you've said, there's annual goals, right? But we know we can't just say on track, off track for an annual goal. That's not enough. So I like to break them up into what we call quarterly rocks,
Yeah,
right? And in order to define a quarterly rock, it has to be SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, timely, realistic, or realistic and timely. So, because one of the detriments of setting up a quarterly rock that isn't achieved is because you didn't define it correctly. And you have
yes,
to understand when you define it, not only is it realistic and I can achieve it within that amount of time, but is it specific enough so that by the end of the quarter we say, well, is it or isn't it, right? Is this, well, depending on how you say it. So that certainly is it. And then to your other point, which is leading indicators. I say under the rock is the measurables, right? So what are those key aspects that we're going to be measuring that are related to that quarterly rock so that we can see at least there's some movement. And if all of those measurables were to be achieved, then theoretically that quarterly rock will be achieved. And if that quarterly rock is achieved, then obviously your annual goal is achieved. So very, very similar way of thought, just using some kind of different terminology. So these are all really good points from a kind of a kinetic functional standpoint. One thing that I wanted to get some of your feedback on is within this product development committee, What are some of the qualities, leadership qualities that you think are critical for each function to be able to bring in so that this committee and this team can be optimized?
Yeah, that's a really important piece to build trust, right? And be effective. Like I said, I'm very Lean Six Sigma kind of discipline. So efficiency comes from these critical um, traits, if I should put it that way, for the folks who are going to be on this committee. So first, you got to have exceptional communication skills. You have to be able to communicate across the disciplines, um, so that way, especially if you're a scientist, for example, that complex scientific topics is understandable with the business, stakeholders, and so that way they can understand the commercial implications. So that's an example of why communication skills become critical, especially to balance risk, and then for your peers, if you're an R&D scientist, to really work with you, right? um, I feel integrity and transparency is critical. That goes towards trust. You have to share the good news and the bad news. You got to share that early. You have to be honest, and you also have to be balanced in terms of how to approach things. You can't be, uh, excuse my French, Debbie Downer, but you can't be always looking at the sky and then
Mm,
lose a trust in you, right? So I think that's, to me, that's pretty critical. Now, I also feel this um, empathy. I know it's a soft one to mention, but it builds loyalty between the team. When you're an empathetic and you have an emotional intelligence to your teammates, very, very critical, because you're there. This is your family. This is your life. This is your partners. So, for example, understanding what motivates the parties, right? Researchers, oh my God, scientific discovery and validation is critical, right? I really want to discover something and I want to validate that I'm right. If you're the clinician, you want patient outcomes. You want the patient to obviously get to a better stage. If you're a business leader, you want to talk about the ROI. I want to
mm,
know, with all this hard work, is this viable? Are we going to make money? Are we going to, inject the
mm.
investment that we need, in the company so we can do more of it? So to me, those are critical. Those are soft skills, but they're so important to build the fabric. And one thing I would tell you that I've over the years learned and I appreciated and I continue to coach is the systems thinking. Do not only think in your silo. Um, the problems that we normally try to solve to get products out are a system, is a living and breathing system. So the interdependencies between science, clinical development, regulatory affairs, commercialization, it's a system, it's a trade off. Sometimes you may decide to delay the regulatory submission in favor of some newer results that may actually strengthen your submission.
Mm.
That's the healthy tension that you're going to have with the business plan, because everybody wants it done on this time, but then your assurance of getting that product approved may go up. But
Mm.
you have to understand the system as a whole and think that way.
Yeah, I love it. Um, One of the things that you're talking about here
Mhm.
is really, so we talked about this product development committee. why it needs to be formed, who should be involved, some of the kind of the day-to-day aspects and things of that nature. And then now that we're talking about the team, you've really highlighted how important it is that you hire or bring in the right people because if you don't have, even if they're the right function, if they're not the right person, you can run into a lot of challenges that might be difficult to overcome. You mentioned communication, that's, to reference an old GI Joe cartoon, that's half the battle,
Yeah,
right? And it's interesting how much we as a society, when it comes to university education, focus on the other half, which is the technical understanding. And yes, we have, communications classes and college writing, but the communication can't be understated in terms of the value that it brings to not just leadership groups and teams, but just any productive organization. Integrity is definitely permission to play. Any sign of a lack of integrity needs to be held at the highest level of risk and concern, because that's an indicator of character, which generally is deeply embedded and won't be overcome in the short term. Transparency is super important, and I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is uh, that the truth will set you free with hope.
yep,
And so if you have bad news or news that isn't going to be celebrated, it still needs to be provided. But you as an executive and a leader need to understand that people are going to ask as soon as they hear that, okay, then what?
that's right.
And if you aren't giving them the then what that they can believe in, then that is going to become a challenge to overcome. The other thing I think that a lot of people have to consider that just kind of helps back up your idea that we need transparency is I believe that if they don't have the accurate story, they will, because we're all humans, create their own internal story.
That's right.
And 9 times out of 10, the story that they create in their head is worse than what the truth is. So definitely transparency is up there. Trust, I think, goes along with a lot of what you mentioned earlier. One of the things that I've heard, which is kind of a really cool way to define trust, is it's character times competence. So in order for me or anyone for me to trust someone or for somebody to trust me, does that person have character and are they competent? Because you can't just have one without the other. Um, so I now want to go into you've hired the right people, we've got the right process and system in place, okay? But now there are some issues, okay? There's some internal conflicts that are happening across functions.
Yep.
That is inevitable. And so the listeners of this audience know that hurdle is going to arise. How do you best handle that?
So you said it well. It is inevitable that there's going to be issues, right? Um, in all candor, my personal philosophy is if there are no issues, it's boring. You know, it's just too simple, certainly for me. Um, but when these issues do arise, and whether it's from the science point of view, it's not what we expected, or we ran into a snag because the regulatory body required more information than what we planned for. These things are very typical in the product development cycle. The healthy team will take a minute to let it sink in, but then start laying out options, right? And the consequences of these options. Um, and I would tell you, this is where the leadership becomes critical, because it's inevitably, uh, especially in a very high stressful environment, that people will start, just human beings will start looking at each other as like, is it you? Is it me? Um, so the leadership has to take that and say, okay, um, yeah, it stinks. Um, we hit a bump. The goal is still there. I always say saving lives, especially in the life science, business. Our goal is not budging; it's saving lives, and those could be loved ones.
Mm,
So we have a bump, and now we need to start laying out contingencies.
mm,
So why don't we take some time, uh, let the team come back with options, define what that option is, what the impact is going to be, how doable is it, what do you need? Focusing on the action rather than the emotion becomes driving, to solutions. Because folks, when they're busy to recover, the emotions get taken out, and the tension between the team gets focused on the work, less on could I have done it better?
oh, I
Should I have
understand.
done
Yeah.
the, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that to me, I've always learned over the years, um, start solving options versus lamenting on could have, would have, should have. Because there's always, when the project is done, there's a post-mortem. And the project manager does a post-mortem with the leadership and their team first, and then lessons learned. And then we get better. Continuous improvement is part of our fabric.
Yeah. I love it. Um, there's a couple things that you said. One is you used the word healthy team. That was a very important qualifier
Yep.
in your explanation there. And what I did like is you were able to zoom out, right? So there's issues, but hold on a second. Let's zoom out. What are we actually doing? We're saving lives, right? And I think that helps to recalibrate where everybody's mindset needs to come to in order to have the energy in
Yep.
order to, come up with the
Yep.
correct solution. I want to dive a little bit deeper into some issues that might not be as easy to handle.
Sure.
Okay. So let's say one of the issues is we thought we had the right team member in charge of a functional area. And we've hit a snag in terms of our product development. And we're now starting to understand that the team isn't as healthy as we thought. And it could be a single individual, it might be two. Obviously, it would be hard to believe that it would be everyone or the majority, right? That
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
But let's say we made a mistake. We hired somebody, or we either hired them in that way, or they've, turned out to be a member that, isn't in the defined as being healthy, and maybe even politics are getting involved. That's a very difficult thing to discuss, but it's something that a lot of people have to deal with. So, what's your comment and your advice when somebody's in that situation?
So I'll start with the Meister, right? The project manager or the program manager. Uh, Transparency is key. So let's just say you're on my team and we ran into that snag that you were just defining. It is imperative that the project manager addresses it right away.
Mm,
So let's just say this person is disruptive or the team is perceiving a different agenda, or they're trying to save their skin or something, right?
mm,
So why leadership is so critical in these settings is you have got to be able to sense that and then follow up immediately, right? So, hey, Nick, we're in this meeting. I have sensed the following. I just wanted to check with you. This is what I'm seeing. Uh, I wanted to talk about what I'm noticing And I really would like to kind of head it off from the beginning so that way there's no misunderstanding or miscommunication. Or if there's something that is truly happening, I need to kind of square that off because your teammates are depending on you,
Mm.
right? So identifying it, uh, confronting the problem in an appropriate manner becomes critical. Let's just say Nick is not responding. Okay. Well, the maestro also touches base with the function heads. And, like I always say, everybody has a boss and brings it up as not a complaint initially, but, I'm seeing this happening in the settings. I was wondering, if Nick is reacting to something that I should be aware of. So that way, it's not putting Nick in a bad spot with his boss, and yet you're opening the door to have this discussion. Now, if for whatever reason this doesn't get addressed and that needs to be elevated, if you recall, we talked about the daily management and then there's the weekly update.
Mm-hmm.
If it is impacting the performance of the team, in the weekly update, usually it's the project manager with the leads. And then there's a section at the end of the update is we call it team dynamics. And it gets discussed, it gets brought up. And that's why the communication skills of the leadership becomes critical. Because you can go into that meeting and say, Nick is disruptive. He's creating problems. But you can go in and say, after a number of engagements, I want to bring this to the table because the team dynamics is starting to get impacted. And then be able to say, here's some options.
Mm. Yeah, I love it. Um, I like what you had to say in terms of immediate action because first it can provide justification that that action is acceptable. And
Yep,
so there could be some confusion from the party as to why all of a sudden is a problem now,
exactly.
right? So that's a good reason for that. The other thing is it can snowball.
Oh,
So
yeah,
if it's X the first time, it could be 2X the next time, 3X the next time, right? And each time that negative action occurs, it impacts the team even more. So that's great. The other thing I liked is, and I think this was insinuated in your response, is that's a private conversation that you're having initially. So, certainly praising in public, criticizing in private is an appropriate approach. Another thing that you said, and hopefully everybody picked up on it, was you said, "I'm seeing," because the person that you're speaking to can't debate what you're seeing,
right.
right? They could clarify that what you're seeing is inaccurate and then further explain why that's inaccurate, but they can't debate
That
on
is
the
correct.
fact on what you're actually seeing. So I really like that. Um, so, I think this has been a really good insight into, leadership in a cross-functional life science company and everything that goes into it. And obviously, this is a podcast and not a 3-day training. So I'm sure there's a lot more that we could get into. I would just like to know, what else would you like to leave the audience with in terms of advice, food for thought, or even resources that they might be able to go and find in order to develop this?
Yeah, if I could sum this up in terms of an effective leader in the product development cycle, is a leader that does not uh, forget, especially in the life science sector, what we're all here for,
Mm,
the patient. If you always keep the patient in everything that you're doing, I think you will be highly respected, more motivated to get the right product between speed, quality, and safety out there. And then your engagement with the stakeholders will be motivating because we're
mm,
really all after the patient, which could be us, a loved one. So that's important. And then I would say, we talked a little bit about communication, trust, humility, know-how, right? Experience. Um, you know, I always say I hire people that are better than me. One is it's a great team. Two is I'll learn, and then they'll make me a better leader. So if you could kind of keep an eye on these, especially in the product development cycle, and recognize, it's nobody has a perfect, but when we're all kind of focusing on the goal to save somebody's life or improve the quality of life, people will generally come together much better.
Yeah. Well, that's a great way to summarize it and finish it off with really refocusing on what the most important aspect is and being able to zoom out. So I really appreciate that. So thank you very much for being on. Much appreciated. For everyone that's listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network. If you have not already, subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.